Food price inflation has been 36% higher in Canada than in the United States of America because of our brutal carbon tax. 1 in 10 Torontonians now have to go to a food bank every single month. There are 1,400 homeless encampments in Ontario after 9 years of Trudeau and the NDP Liberals. They've doubled the debt, doubled housing costs, given Canadians the worst mortgage debt as a share of GDP of any G7 country. Today, Stats Canada reported that the gap between rich and poor is at its highest level in recorded history, after NDP Liberal money printing inflated the assets of the super rich while inflating the cost of living for everyone else. And the Parliamentary Budget Officer released another report today on the carbon tax. And that report confirmed everything I've been saying about this horrible tax, this ripoff. It showed that 60% of Canadians pay more in the carbon tax than they get back in rebates. 100% of middle-class Canadians lose out. And that gap will get worse as the government goes ahead with its Liberal NDP plan to quadruple the tax to 61 cents a litre over the next 5.5 years. 61 cents a litre will mean we have among the highest fuel taxes in the world. Next door in the U.S., they have no carbon tax. Our trucks, our businesses, our workers, our money will pour over the border, leaving behind a nuclear winter for our economy. Grocery stores won't be able to get their goods. Factories won't be able to get their parts. Workers won't be able to get their paychecks as trucks can no longer afford to fuel the transportation of the essentials of life. And that will mean desperate poverty for countless people. That's why we need a carbon tax election where Canadians can choose between a 61 cent a litre carbon tax or axing the carbon tax altogether. An NDP Liberal costly carbon tax coalition that tax your food, punish your work, take your money, double your housing costs, and unleash crime and chaos, or common sense Conservatives who will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. The worst crime of all is the crimes that have been targeting our Jewish communities. We have seen a 251% increase in hate crimes in Canada under Trudeau and the NDP Liberals. Those crimes were up 165% before October 7th. And while the attacks of that day haunt us still, we cannot blame the chaos on our streets on some foreign problem. This hate crime targeting our Jewish people and our countless other peoples was out of control before then. And by the way, there have been wars in the Middle East for decades. They didn't spill onto our streets. In the 1967 war, in the War of Yom Kippur, the two intifadas, the Hezbollah-Israel war of 2006, we didn't have firebombings of synagogues in Canada during those conflicts. We didn't have bullets flying through the window of children's schools during those conflicts. We didn't have bricks throwing through the windows of the Pride of Israel during those conflicts. What has changed? What has changed is we have a prime minister with a radical and divisive ideology that turns Canadian against Canadian. He has broken our borders. He's allowed repeat violent criminals to run free in our streets. He's allowed ISIS terrorists to come in through our immigration system, even after they were videotaped, cutting up human bodies in the Middle East as part of the ISIS organization. They come into Canada, and he gives them citizenship in this country where they plot to carry out new terrorist attacks. Justin Trudeau is not worth the cost, crime, chaos, and he's not worth the risk of terrorism. Furthermore, we have known terrorist groups able to operate legally and with impunity in Canada. I pointed out the other day Samadun, which held these horrific protests where they were calling for death to Israel, death to America, death to Canada. They burned our flag. These monsters are a front for another terrorist group in the Middle East that has been banned for 20 years. The Americans, the Europeans and other countries have tackled this terrorist group, but why in Canada does Justin Trudeau continue to pander to these terrorist supporters by allowing them to operate legally, even when they have violated our anti-terrorism laws? Another example, of course, is the Houthis. The Houthis have been operating on our country, even though they can operate in our country. We don't know for sure if they have because we don't have laws to stop or even surveil it. But the Houthis are a front for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an organization that is the biggest and most well-organized terrorist group in the world, which supports Hamas and Hezbollah. This organization murdered 55 Canadian citizens by shooting a missile at a civilian aircraft over Iran, blowing it out of the sky 4 years ago, and yet Trudeau allowed them to stay legal, raising money and terrorizing our people for years after that. Now, a related front group, the Houthis, continues to fire missiles at civilians, attack merchant ships that carry critical civilian and humanitarian aid, killing civilian workers on those ships. The Americans banned the Houthis back in January. The Liberals at the time said they were thinking about it. What is there to think about? Since October 7th, the terrorist attacks, Houthi terrorists have disregarded international law. They carry out attacks in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. According to the American Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, since November 2023, the Houthis have launched unprecedented attacks against international maritime vessels in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, as well as military forces positioned in the area to defend the safety and security of commercial shipping. These attacks against international shipping have endangered mariners, disrupted the free flow of commerce, and interfered with the navigational rights and freedoms. Earlier this month, a Houthi spokesman celebrated the attacks they had done and said they've targeted 193 ships linked to the Israeli, American, and British enemy. They've also launched hundreds of missiles at innocent Israeli civilians to support Hamas. The Houthis operate with the support of the criminal regime in Tehran who helped organize the October 7th attack. The murderous Iranian regime uses groups like Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas to spread violence and terror throughout the world. That's why the Americans have designated them as a terrorist group, and they have called on others to do the same. Jewish Canadians and all Canadians deserve to feel safe. They deserve to know that they will not be targeted by terrorist groups that operate here, launder money here, finance organized crime here, and foment hatred here. And for these reasons, common sense conservatives are calling on the NDP Liberal government to list the Houthis as a terror group under Section 83.05 of the anti-terrorism law. That will allow our law enforcement the power to seize their bank accounts, shut down their operations, criminalize recruitment, logistics, and planning on Canadian soil to keep our people safe. And safety is what we want. We want peace again. We want to bring home the country we knew and still love, where anyone from anywhere can do anything, where hard work earns a powerful paycheck that buys affordable food, gas, and homes in safe communities. That's the Canada we knew. That's the Canada we love. Let's bring it home.
We'll now take questions from the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Privier, for this important press conference. And actually, we know that Canada is a place for all, not for terrorists and terrorism. What we have seen in the last few years, that some weird demonstrations, I call it chaos, that include people who insult Canada and wish death to our beautiful country. And the most painful thing is to burn my flag, my Canadian flag. This is so painful for all of the Canadians. The people who do this are covering their faces. We don't know their identity, and this is also a big problem because as a journalist and media, Canadian media from Middle East roots, we receive some threats. My question is, why the police and the authorities do not take actions against this, because it is not one time, two times, it is repeated over a long time, and there is some violence, there is some threat for many people, and we do not used to have Canada like this. If you, in your position, you are the opposition leader, what you can do to return Canada now, and if you are the Prime Minister, God willing, what you can do to make our culture is quiet and safe again.
Thank you very much for that question, and I'm so sorry that you have faced these threats. This is another example of our country devolving into chaos, everything is broken. When we have patriotic journalists facing threats of violence from terrorist sympathizers who now operate with impunity after 9 years of Trudeau and the NDP and their radical, divisive, dangerous ideologies. The police need to enforce existing laws and arrest anyone who's making these threats against journalists. We need to lock up violent offenders and keep them behind their bars with jail and not bail, with mandatory jail time for serious violent offenses. We need to ban the terrorist organizations that have been fomenting this hate and these attacks, Samadoun, Houthis, and others. Samadoun was on our streets 2 or 3 days ago celebrating the genocide, the biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, burning our flags, organizing hatred and making overt calls for violence against our people. Samadoun, the Houthis, and their organizers should be arrested. They should be put behind bars. We should secure our borders to keep terrorists and those who work with them out of our country and keep our country safe again. And we need a prime minister who will unite our people and bind up the wounds of the nation by bringing home the country that we knew and still love.
Thank you. Next question.
Shahrzad Ghani from Epoch Times Persian. Mr. Paliev, now IRGC is listed as a terrorist organization. What is your plan in the future as like a Paliev's government plan to take some actions? Looks like just listing IRGC as a terrorist organization is not enough. What is your plan to just take some more actions specifically for Iranian community here to feel safe, that they're living in a safe environment without interference from Islamic Republic? And also, what actions can be taken to immediately deport those who have ties with Islamic Republic?
Thank you. Great question. And first of all, thank you to the courageous Persian population in Canada who have consistently stood up against the regime in Tehran in massive demonstrations, which I have been honored to attend. The Persian community, like the Jewish community, is under attack. The IRGC and 700 Iranian agents are operating with impunity on our soil, threatening, harassing, abusing our Persian and Jewish people here in Canada. And it's time for the RCMP and the police to track down these agents, charge them, and if they are not citizens or permanent residents, they need to be expelled from our country. We see top officials from the Iranian government that have been seen in gyms and living in mansions and enjoying the plunder that they stole from the Iranian people here in our country. They should be expelled from our country. We should issue deportations on them because they are terrorizing our Persian people here in Canada. We must make sure that IRGC cannot set up a proxy organization like they always do. That's what the Tehran does. The Tehran doesn't do it directly. They always get a proxy to do it. And so the Houthis could become that proxy in the future now that the IRGC is finally banned. We need to ban the Houthis. We need to quickly set up the foreign influence registry that the liberals have been dragging their feet on, and that way we can expose anyone who's working for a foreign dictatorship, jail them if they break the law, expel them if they are harassing our population. We will once and then make this a safe place for all Canadians, Persian Canadians, Jewish Canadians, Canadians of all backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Mr. Polyev. Good morning. I just wanted to pivot to something else. You voted in favor of the Bloc Québécois motion to boost OAS for some seniors. Is this something your party will do if elected? And I could just ask you to answer in English and French. Thank you.
Thank you. After 9 years of Trudeau and the NDP Liberals, seniors struggle to eat, heat, and house themselves. The rent has doubled. Mortgage payments have doubled. Food price inflation has been the worst in 40 years, and those prices have risen 36% faster in Canada than in the U.S., proving it's not a global phenomenon that's causing the higher grocery prices. It's here at home. And we know that the carbon tax is principally responsible for the higher food prices. Of course, if you tax the farmer who grows the food and the trucker who ships the food, you tax all who buy the food. So we're of the view that seniors need more purchasing power. And that's what we signaled with that vote. There are other ways to do it, though. For example, by axing the carbon tax and lowering income tax, you can allow seniors to keep more of their pension and their retirement income and make those dollars go further. So as we develop our platform, we will bring forward a low-tax plan that allows seniors to have more powerful pensions and to bring home the affordable prices that will allow them to have a dignified retirement, which the people who built our country deserve more than anyone else. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Après 9 ans de Justin Trudeau et les libéraux, les aînés ont de la misère à payer leurs factures. Le coût de logement a doublé. Le coût de nourriture a augmenté 36% plus rapidement ici au Canada qu'aux États-Unis. Ce qui met de l'évidence que ce n'est pas un phénomène international, mais c'est lié aux taxes et aux dépenses inflationnistes de Justin Trudeau. On voit qu'un nombre record des gens doivent aller aux banques alimentaires. Donc, les conservateurs ont voté pour signaler que les aînés devraient avoir plus de pouvoir d'achat. Il y a d'autres façons de les aider. On peut couper les impôts. Les aînés paient beaucoup d'impôts sur leurs pensions et sur leurs fonds de retraite. Et nous regardons des propositions pour couper les impôts pour tout le monde. Ça va récompenser le travail des plus jeunes, des petites entreprises, mais aussi les aînés. Et nous allons réduire le coût de la vie en éliminant les déficits inflationnistes et en réparant le budget. C'est ça notre plan de gros bon sens. Couper taxes et impôts, bâtir des logements, réparer le budget et stopper les crimes.
Thank you. Next question.
Ms. Polyev, good morning. David Menzies with Rebel News. Given the immigration minister's shocking comments about the lack of security vetting for migrants, should Canada suspend bringing any more refugees from Gaza?
We can't let anyone in unless they have been thoroughly vetted. All of their background, all of their affiliations need to be clearly vetted because you're quite right in saying that this government of Justin Trudeau has let in criminals and terrorists. In the case of, think of this case of this apparent ISIS fighter who appears to have been in a video cutting up a human body on a crucifix in the Middle East. He did this, according to this video, before he was granted admission to Canada and then given citizenship in this country. And then finally, we had to arrest him because the French reached out and said they had intelligence that he was about to carry out a massive terrorist attack here in the Greater Toronto area. And then there was a second terrorist who got into this country and then ultimately was preparing an attack on Jews from Canada to go to New York where he was going to kill the Jewish population there. Justin Trudeau has lost control of our borders. His radical ideology, his total incompetence, and his appalling border policies are dangerous to the country. When I am Prime Minister, yes, we will welcome immigrants, but we will do so by vetting security and their lawfulness and ensuring that the people who come here are safe and our citizens are likewise safe.
Thank you. This will be the final question.
Jeff Gray, Globe and Mail. I wanted to ask another question about the PBO report, which also says that according to Environment Canada data, the industrial carbon price is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than the price for consumers. So are you committed to keeping the industrial carbon price in place?
Well, as you know, the Liberals have given heavy industry an exemption from the carbon tax. They are under a different policy that is pretty much run by the provinces. The federal government is not administering that policy in almost any province. It is provincial governments across the country that do that. My focus is on axing the carbon tax. The carbon tax, which has driven up gas and diesel by 17 cents a liter, has driven up home heating costs by hundreds of dollars every single year, and which Trudeau plans to quadruple to 61 cents a liter, a policy that would cripple our economy and do nothing for the environment other than push production to dirty foreign dictatorships. Trudeau wants to push jobs and businesses out and global pollution up. I want to bring costs down so that we can bring home clean, green Canadian production to our economy. Let's axe the tax. Let's bring it home.
Can we get that in French?
Merci beaucoup. Le politique, moi je vais abolir la taxe carbone qui augmente le coût pour les consommateurs, le coût de tout, le coût de nourriture, de l'essence, des matériaux de base pour construire des logements sont plus chers en passant à cause de cette taxe. Les politiques industrielles sont gérées par les provinces, y compris au Québec. Ils ont déjà leur propre politique là-dessus. Donc, mes efforts seront pour abolir la taxe carbone sur les consommateurs.
I just wanted to ask you about involuntary treatment. In Ontario, this is something municipalities are calling for. The big city mayors, they started a motion on this, and they are debating and updating the Healthcare Act to actually implement involuntary treatment. I know in the past you said you were open to it, but you needed more time to learn about it. So where do you currently stand on this?
Thank you very much. Great question. We just heard testimony from the parents of a beautiful young girl named Brianna from British Columbia who the authorities released from a psychiatric hospital despite the fact that her parents had begged them to keep her in treatment. She had stabbed her hand with a pencil. She was clearly a very big danger to herself. The system released her, offered, of course, crack pipes and other drug paraphernalia for her to safely use drugs. She ended up in a homeless encampment where she died of an overdose, a teenager. There's no question in my mind that she should have been in mandatory, involuntary, psychiatric, and substance abuse treatment rather than in a homeless encampment in a tent. So I believe for children and for prisoners who are behind bars, there should be mandatory drug treatment when they are found to be incapable of making decisions for themselves. For adults, again, I'm still doing a lot of research on how that would work. But what I will say is we need to defund the unsafe government supply of drugs that the Trudeau and the NDP regimes are pushing on the population. We need to ban hard substances, start to prosecute drug criminals, scan the shipping containers to stop illegal drugs and guns from coming in, and treat addiction with rehab and recovery so that we can bring our loved ones home drug-free. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Defense Minister Bill Blair told the Star yesterday that nuclear strikes on nuclear facilities
Changed his mind.
contrary to the law of armed conflict. What is your response to that?
He changed his mind today. You have to look at his flip-flop today in committee. So, well, I've already stated my stance multiple times, but you should just note that yesterday the Liberals were saying that they had no problem with Iran, a genocidal, unstable, terrorist regime that had killed 55 Canadian citizens and is threatened to wipe Israel and America off the map. The Liberals said they had no problem with that country and that dictatorship getting nuclear weapons. Today, Bill Blair flip-flopped in committee and said that there would be certain circumstances where a strike against a nuclear weapons manufacturing facility would be allowed. So you have to ask Bill Blair where he stands because he keeps changing his mind every single day. That's why we cannot trust Justin Trudeau and the NDP Liberals. They allowed the IRGC to remain legal in Canada for 4 years after it murdered 55 of our Canadian citizens. They allow 700 IRGC terrorist agents to terrorize our streets here in Canada. And as of yesterday, we're of the view that that unstable terrorist regime should be allowed to develop nuclear weapons that could kill millions of people. This is an example of just how dangerous and radical the NDP Liberal government has been.
Okay, so we've got a stack of articles here about Canada, and wow, they are fired up about the cost of living there. Like, seriously fired up. Food prices, housing, you name it. They're claiming it's way worse than here in the U.S. And they seem convinced the carbon tax is the big bad wolf. What do you think?
Well, it's tricky. You know how they say correlation doesn't equal causation? That's key here. The articles are pointing fingers at the carbon tax, but there's a lot more going on globally that affects food prices. Think about it. Supply chains have been through the ringer lately, and then there's the whole Russia-Ukraine thing. Russia's a major fertilizer exporter.
Yeah.
So that conflict messed with agricultural production everywhere. And don't even get me started on the weather. Droughts, floods. You can't grow food without the right weather. It all adds up to a big old mess that goes way beyond just one policy.
Yeah, it's like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Especially when you see how it's hitting regular people. This one article talks about Toronto, where apparently 1 in 10 people rely on food banks every month. And homelessness in Ontario is through the roof. That's heartbreaking.
It really is. And they're especially worried about the middle class. They say those folks are getting squeezed the hardest. Despite those rebates they're talking about, apparently 60% of Canadians end up paying more in carbon tax than they get back. And they're claiming the middle class is carrying the biggest load. Makes you wonder if it's really fair,
And it sounds like it could get even worse. They're saying this tax might go up to 61 cents per liter of fuel. That would put Canada among the countries with the highest fuel taxes in the world. They're even suggesting that businesses and workers might start heading south to the U.S. where there's no federal carbon tax.
Yeah, they're painting a pretty bleak picture. Empty grocery store shelves, factories struggling to get parts because trucks can't afford to run. It's a domino effect that could really snowball if they're right. I mean, whether there'll be a mass exodus is debatable. You'd need to look at a ton of data to figure that out. Yeah, it's definitely a worry for them.
And it's not just about the economics. They're calling for a whole election dedicated to this carbon tax thing. Like, they want Canadians to march to the polls and decide the fate of this policy once and for all.
Yeah, they're drawing a pretty clear line in the sand. It's like they're saying, are you with us or against us?
Totally. They even frame it as this battle between what they call the costly carbon tax coalition and this other side. This side that wants to cut taxes, make housing affordable, and get tough on crime. It's powerful stuff.
They're definitely tapping into something real. Like, a lot of Canadians are feeling the pinch, and they're looking for answers.
And they don't hold back on the Prime Minister either. They call his ideology radical and divisive, and they use this phrase, NDP liberal leader. I've never heard that before. Have you?
Yeah, that's definitely a loaded term. It's like they're trying to link the Liberals to the NDP. Paint them as super left-wing, trying to stir up those anxieties about socialism and all that.
Makes sense. And get this, they connect this radical ideology to the whole rise in crime in Canada. They even mentioned a 251% increase in hate crimes under the current government. Wild, right?
Oh, well, okay. We need to be careful here. Hate crimes are a really complex issue. It's not as simple as blaming a political party or ideology. There's a lot more to unpack there.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
But it's still scary. They even talk about attacks on Jewish communities. It's like they're saying this political climate is creating a breeding ground for hate.
It's definitely a serious accusation, and it's something that needs to be investigated thoroughly. But we need to be cautious about drawing those direct connections without solid evidence.
Okay, so we're not jumping to conclusions, but it's interesting how they compare this to past situations. Like, they talk about the war in Lebanon back in 2006. Remember that. They're saying that even with all the tension back then, things didn't spill over into Canada the way they are now. It's like they're implying something fundamental has changed.
Yeah, they're suggesting that Canada's current approach to international affairs is somehow backfiring, like it's creating division and unrest at home. It's a pretty bold claim.
And to make matters worse, they actually say that Canada has become a haven for dangerous groups. They even name-drop this group called Samadone. Apparently, they're allowed to operate freely even though they allegedly incite violence and burn the Canadian flag. That's intense.
Yeah, and it gets even more serious. They're claiming the government has given citizenship to people with suspected ties to terrorism. They even bring up this one case where a guy was arrested for allegedly plotting an attack. It's like they're building this whole narrative that Canada's going soft on terrorism and is putting everyone at risk.
And then they shift gears completely. Suddenly, we're talking about the Houthis in Yemen.
It's quite a jump, right?
Totally. They're claiming this group is operating right here in Canada. And get this, they want them labeled as a full-blown terrorist organization.
Yeah, they're really upping the ante. It's like they're connecting these domestic anxieties to this whole global threat. And they're not pulling any punches when it comes to Iran either. They call Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the biggest and most organized terrorist group out there.
Intense. And they keep bringing up that horrible plane crash a few years back. The one with the civilian aircraft.
Right. They're using that as a prime example of the IRGC's reach. They're accusing them of orchestrating the whole thing and criticizing Canada for not being tougher on Iran afterwards.
They seem especially furious that the government didn't ban the IRGC immediately after that incident.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, see? This is what happens when you don't take action.
And now they're drawing a parallel between that and the whole Houthi situation.
Exactly. They're pointing to the Houthis' recent attacks on those ships. And their ties to Hamas, they're saying it's a clear pattern of dangerous behavior.
So they're basically saying that by not coming down hard on the Houthis, Canada's giving Iran a free pass.
That's the gist of it. They're arguing that the Houthis are basically Iran's puppets. And they keep mentioning how the U.S. labeled the Houthis as terrorists back in January.
Like, Canada should just get with the program right.
Pretty much. But they're not stopping at just labels. They want action.
What kind of action are we talking about?
They're talking about hitting the Houthis where it hurts their finances. They want the Canadian government to use those anti-terrorism laws to disrupt their operations. Stop any recruiting or planning that might be happening on Canadian soil. The whole 9 yards.
Wow. So we've gone from worrying about grocery bills to international terrorism. It's a lot to process. What's the most important thing for people to remember from all of this?
I think the key takeaway here is to be careful about jumping to conclusions. We've heard a lot of strong opinions, some pretty scary accusations. But it's important to remember that this is just one side of a very complex story.
So what should people do?
Don't just take their word for it. Do your own research. Look for different perspectives. Try to find out what's missing from this narrative.
That's what I love about these deep dives. They make you think critically. And that's so important these days with so much information flying around.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride.
Anytime. It's been fascinating.